It's time for our final panel of the day, which I'm very, very happy and excited to be moderating. This panel on technology and the next generation of news storytelling. With me on the stage are, from my far left, inward, are Bob Beichel, managing editor of NBC Left Field, Emily Cassie, director of visual projects for the Marshall Project, Matt Pearl, chief of storytelling and development for Tegna's WXIA in Atlanta, and Frederick Root, Director of Sales Americas for Delect. Now, I want to start today by showing you samples of their work. And we're going to front load the videos, give you a chance to see them, and we're going to discuss the work just after. So the first clip is from Matt Pearl.
Dear the Radney family,
dear the Radneys,
Sarah doesn't deserve this. We all want to ask God why you took her too soon.
The town of Cairo, Georgia, largely eluded Hurricane Michael, but it suffered the storm's biggest loss.
She could do the impossible.
We said we would always be sisters.
She had a heart that was made of pure light.
11-year-old Sarah Radney was staying with her grandparents in Lake Seminole, in the direct eye of Michael. The storm slammed a carport through her grandparents' roof. Sarah was hit and killed. 1 month later, the pain lingers.
Do you hurt? Okay.
Georgia and Abigail Radney play with their mother
Here you go.
in the room they shared with their sister. Sarah's clothes and toys remain spread on the bed.
I kind of enjoy going back there and not moving anything right now. I think everybody's kind of okay with her still being back there, you know. This is God's will. I miss Sarah, and I'd give anything to have her back. I would have taken her place in a second, but God wanted his angel.
5 minutes up the road, for 8 hours a day, Roy Radney does his job. He must.
I know physically, to move on, I've got to get up. I've got to get ready for work. I've got to go to work every morning. But mentally, I'm here at work, but my mind is not here, you know, hardly ever. And I know it shouldn't be this way, but if I have a good day, I go home and I can't help it. I feel guilty about it, you know, because my daughter's laying 6 foot in a grave, you know, and why should I deserve to have a good day?
But the same father who says that, minutes later, says this.
A month ago, if you'd asked me, was there much good left in the world, I'd have said no. But now my mind has totally changed.
The community in Cairo has rallied for the Radneys. The family's church took care of Sarah's funeral. 500 people donated $23,000 on GoFundMe. And at Sarah's new school, they gathered on the field. They released balloons, and dozens of classmates
Monday when I walked into school, I know she was walking with me.
wrote letters of condolence
Don't be down. She'll always be with you in your heart.
for the family of their friend.
She is an angel on your shoulder, and you will see her again in heaven.
It takes something like this to open up your eyes and stop taking for granted what you're holding and love it just a little bit more. I don't see this town letting the memory of Sarah go away ever.
Next up is just the first two and a half minutes or so of a longer piece by Emily Cassie. I think the piece overall is about 13 minutes.
There were times where I was tied with both hands to the bedpost like this, and both legs. I'm naked, and he would inject me with either heroin or he would put a crack pipe to my mouth and light it for me. I was only 19, and I was just no longer a human being. I was property.
This story starts in Florida, the rehab capital of America. It begins with Simone, a 23-year-old addicted to heroin and crack cocaine who's been bought and sold by fraudulent halfway homes and drug treatment centers across the state.
In 3 years, I've been to 45 halfway houses. what we call flap houses.
Simone is one of thousands caught in a corrupt system of recovery facilities that illegally make millions from addicts' insurance policies. So, who are the people buying and selling addicts? They call them body snatchers or junkie hunters, and many of these hunters are after something much darker.
I've been a cop since 1979.
That's Ted Paddock. He's the lead investigator on the Sober Home Task Force in Palm Beach County.
I've lived through the cocaine cowboys. I've lived through the crack epidemic. I've never thought that I'd be involved in something as terrible as this. Well, like any big scam, you follow the money. In this instance, it centers around urine samples.
So why urine samples? Well, to understand it, we need to go back to the Affordable Health Care Act and the Parity Act, which in 2010 required insurance policies to cover substance abuse.
After all the votes have been tallied, health insurance reform becomes law in the United States of America.
Providing health insurance coverage to treat addiction is necessary, but without regulation, scam artists are taking advantage of the system by running excessive and unnecessary tests, namely urine analysis. First.
And finally, let's come out of the darkness a little bit with a piece from Bob Beichel and NBC Left Field.
I'm really excited to do this. Let's talk about pockets. Now, I bet a bunch of you just went, what? And the rest of you went, yes, because women's pockets are a thing. Just ask the internet.
Thanks, it has pockets. Literally every woman wearing a dress that has pockets.
I'm wearing a dress with pockets, a cardigan with pockets, and a coat with pockets. I've never felt so powerful. Why are faux pockets even a thing? I have enough disappointments in my life. Thank you very much.
Okay, so in light of the huge issues that women are currently speaking up about, this might seem totally ridiculous, but there is a connection between really big issues and really small details. So why do pockets matter so much right now? When it comes to a history of pockets, you're looking at a fight between utility and appearance. Do you have your keys in your pockets all the time?
Yeah.
Why?
In case I need to open the door.
It's not that women never had pockets, but where and how many was actually related to where women stood in society at any given time. In the 17th century, women wore pockets tied around their waist, and they'd wear them underneath their massive skirts. Now, there's a huge shift in the 19th century where suddenly everyone really wanted much slimmer silhouettes, which meant they literally couldn't fit pockets into the clothes, and instead carried little handbags they called reticules. Shout out to the Rational Dress Society of 1881, but also to Chanel, who in the 20s and 30s started putting pockets on cardigans and trousers, which literally changed the way that women could stand. They also got to vote in the 1920s, and by the time we got to World War II, women were at work and wearing very military-style uniforms, which included pockets. There's huge cultural and social change in the 1960s. And in the 1970s, we hit peak jeans, with women's jeans having pockets in the front and the back, which brings us to today. And after all this, we've still got a problem. Ask anyone.
They're not often very useful. They're either too small or in a very unflattering place. It seems like they're not actually made to function.
We have so many little things that males usually don't need. Sometimes I want to carry a tampon around. I can't do that.
I think they're essential. I think when they're not there, it's sad. Because I'm not really a purse girl. So I really need the pockets for living and breathing.
Think about it. When you call something pocket-sized, it's a shorthand for convenient. But what does pocket-sized even mean when men's pockets are 8.5 inches, women's are 4.5 inches, the average smartphone is 5.5 inches, credit cards are just over 2 inches, and we're expected to put keys somewhere? Not being able to have a functioning pocket actually stops people from just getting on with their day. And this matters more for women now. Since the 1950s, more and more women have been joining the workforce. But it's not just work, women do a lot of things.
A woman's day is split up into a lot of different activities, and we have to wear the same clothes for all of them.
we need places to put things, and we need two free hands. It's going to boil down to taste. Of course you're allowed to have clothes with pockets and without them. They do ruin the line, and you're allowed to care about that still. But we're at a time now when women are doing more things and asking for more things to genuinely make their lives easier. And it might seem insignificant, but that can include a small thing like a functional, good-looking pocket. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to see more things explained in mixed reality, then just click here.
Well, I've got loads of pockets, and I'm never going to take them for granted again. This is some very powerful work from all of you. So first, thank all of you for sharing this work with us. And I want to jump right into what you brought to show us. So Emily, let's start with you. We've just seen a couple of minutes of about a 13-minute documentary on the trafficking of addicts. And among other remarkable qualities, this has the feeling of being very visually cinematic, which is a word that came up in pretty much every conversation that I had in preparation for this panel. So tell us a bit about why you're drawn to that cinematic approach to news storytelling, and then technically, how did you achieve a piece like this?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's good to be up here with some familiar faces. In fact, you might have noticed that my piece was actually for NBC Left Field, which I did with them about a year ago. And when I'm thinking about storytelling, I kind of come at it both as a filmmaker and as an investigative reporter. So for me, I'm thinking about, okay, what is the structural problem that I'm trying to address? And then how do I bring people inside of it? How do I bring people into a climate where we're inundated with really disturbing and traumatizing news day in and day out? So how do I bring people in? Well, we know that people will watch Netflix for hours, and we know that those types of stories can captivate them. So how do we use those cinematic techniques to bring viewers in and to humanize some of our characters? And that's kind of where the impetus comes from of approaching this type of storytelling. Now, of course, depending on the organization that I'm working for, those cinematic techniques are a little bit different. So for NBC Left Field, there was definitely a feeling that we were creating a new brand, something that had a lot of quick cuts and was a bit darker and had these kind of more cinematic movements and push-ins, and we were doing a lot of gimbal work, for instance. I also do quite a bit of work for the New York Times and documentaries for them, and that has a completely different aesthetic. But in either case, I'm always thinking about what is going to bring that audience in and what best serves the story. So that's why I choose to do stories like this. I think they can be more impactful that way as well. And I guess the second question is how to do this kind of story. And for me, I guess I can take the example of this piece, which was that first of all, came the reporting, as always, and the research and understanding what was really going on in Florida and these treatment centers, how they were exploiting these health insurance policies. And what I discovered when I got down there was also this massive sex trafficking ring that was happening with the young women. And so we were trying to not only capture the devastation of being abused in this kind of endless cycle, but also capture the kind of structural intricacies and intrigue that went on. So that's why you have the detective doing the voiceover, kind of talking through his journey, quick cutting between scenes in Delray Beach to try to give you that feeling of that environment and what it might be for an addict. We showed the kind of shots of the ceiling, and we showed like a drip that you didn't see. She talks about being in a bathtub and having kind of a suicidal episode, and we showed kind of like a drip of a drain, and these kind of very dramatic techniques to help you kind of relate to her experience. So the shoot itself was a couple weeks, and then the edit took about 3 to 4 weeks, and we were doing some graphic treatment as well, which we did in the studio. And
how many people end up working on a piece like that?
So I reported and shot the piece. I had a second shooter come down with me for part of the shoot. I did the editing, and then I had a couple folks do some assistant editing, and then I had 2 folks help me with the graphic treatment. So I guess all in all, maybe 5, I think that was.
So Matt, you've also captured some of that same cinematic quality in your own piece, which was done in pretty short order after Hurricane Michael. Talk a little bit about how that piece came together, the time frame, and the tech that you employed there.
So my piece was shot in 5 hours, and it was part of a 4-part series that was done. We called it 1 month after Michael. The idea being that so often, TV news stations blow in for these major events, and then a week later they're gone, and we don't really follow up and see what happens next. And oftentimes what happens next, while not being as immediately visually compelling, can be quite compelling both emotionally and in terms of telling the story of a community. So my managers had the idea, and I went down by myself with 2 different full sets of gear. Normally I shoot with the Sony XD-Cam EX1, and I also took down our station's mirrorless camera, Sony as well. And I essentially kind of ping-ponged back and forth between which gear I used on which stories. I typically like to lean on the EX1 when I have a story that requires a lot of long-distance zooms, a lot of capturing damage both on a wide and a tight level, and we only have 1 lens for our mirrorless camera, which is great for interviews like the ones that you saw in that piece, but for capturing, somebody's torn up roof, it would have been a lot tougher to get those really gripping tight shots like I was able to get with the EX1. But for this story, which was the last one that I shot, I thought that the mirrorless camera was the best way to tell it because it didn't need a whole lot of visual razzle-dazzle. I felt like this was a very sincere story where the emotions of the people interviewed really go a long way. And it was also filmed in a lot of tight spaces. The home where I interviewed Sarah's stepmom was, it was a small home in a small town. The school, we just had a small little conference room to use, so there wasn't a whole lot of space. And I found that the mirrorless really worked to my advantage there because it really could shoot those kind of buttery interviews that it's able to get. So it was shot in 5 hours. It was put together later on as part of an overall package that I did for that series. But to me, we've talked about cinematic, and for me, that it was an example, and the reason I sent it for this was because I think it is an example of how cinematic can work on the local news level where time is tighter and you need to make decisions, but you can still, if you take that extra bit of time to think about production value and setup, it can go a long way, and I think it did in this piece.
And Bob, I appreciate you accommodating me by bringing the razzliest, dazzliest of all the pieces here. Using Google Tilt Brush. Can you talk a little bit about how this particular reporting team, I think it's a duo, isn't it?
Yes.
Came to use this consumer-facing technology and telling news stories with it. And what does it offer that maybe other kinds of augmented reality didn't at the time? And what kind of stories is it suited for? So a multi-part question for you.
Sure. I mean, I think the first part's easiest to answer, specifically because it was something that was consumer grade. So we're trying to think about how do we use these existing tools. Honestly, we were tasked with experimenting. We don't have the largest budget in the world. So our team is very accomplished. They came from the BBC. They're amazing field producers, DPs, and computer hackers, all in this interesting combo that is Deb and Owen. And they had become very interested in VR and started doing things, and they quickly started to think about, well, VR as a delivery platform might not be the way things are going. Not everybody's going to adopt wearing goggles everywhere, but VR as a creation acquisition tool has a lot of untapped resources, and specifically solving, everybody always says, oh, well, if we just made this in animated explainer, they see a Vox video and they're like, we should just do that. Well, what they did there, that's 3 days of shooting. And if you didn't need to incorporate a moving person into the image, you can actually do something like that in a half hour. So what they did is they took Google Tilt Brush, which is basically MS Paint of the virtual reality world. It's the low-hanging fruit, relatively. And they figured out, they use a Teradek, which is like a simultaneous video tool, so they can overlay what's actually being seen in the camera, and there's the receivers for the VR mounted directly on top of the camera. So it's going, layering the virtual world and the reality of what the camera sees and fed back into the camera and recorded that way.
It's a bit of a kit set up then.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that they made themselves, basically. But it's something we've seen examples of people doing exactly that. Sometimes fascinatingly down to the type of music and backgrounds they're using, which is, I mean, it's cool to see how easily like this can be done.
And you've done quite a few of these so far.
Yeah, so their series, they've done over 20, and then we've incorporated that. What's easier to do is if you want to use it in lieu of graphics. So you literally are drawing it out, and it's kind of a tactile experience. It's great for when we're talking about historical timelines, things like that. You can draw something in virtual reality, and then whatever you see, you can record that, so your head becomes the camera and you can move across it. So we often will have somebody shouting out the track that was written, and somebody walking around the room like this trying to hit their marks on where it is in the track.
So now that we talked just a little bit about the specific stories, I want to pull the focus back for a moment to storytelling experimentation more generally. Broadcast TV has been telling stories in more or less a very familiar way for a very long time, for decades, really. So this question is to any of you, so any of you jump in on it. How problematic is that in terms of staying relevant to audiences today, especially younger audiences? And what's perhaps different about how those audiences maybe today want to see a news story told?
Well, I'll go ahead and I guess I'll start. I think it can be problematic depending on what the goal is. But I think certainly what's happened over the last few decades now is that local television news has established what it is in the minds of most people. And I think if you're looking for storytelling like what we've displayed here, that can be challenging to sell in a news environment where younger viewers aren't necessarily looking to local TV news for that. They have other reasons that they're looking for local news, but I think most people who are familiar with many kinds of media, they know that they're not necessarily willing to sit through the standard A block and the usual trappings of local TV news to get to a long-form story. They'd rather go seek it out, and they'd prefer to go elsewhere for that. However, I think that with that in mind, if you are at a station or at a company that promotes innovation and really makes that part of its sell to viewers, I think that's I think it requires that entire company buy-in, that entire station buy-in, to really say this is how we present news. And I think there are a lot of opportunities online as well, where we've seen some success doing a lot of very different kinds of storytelling. We had an investigative piece last month where we hired a graphic artist to essentially make the story into a comic book. And that was a big hit online and did very well for us and had a lot of social value as well. So I think it's fighting an uphill battle a lot of the time because of the standard that's been set in local news. And that's not necessarily a bad standard, but I think local news has established what it is for a lot of people. And that is, that may or may not include necessarily a lot of the innovation we're talking about, but it can be that kind of innovation can be very valuable if put in the right context with the right promotion.
I'm not in broadcast news. I'm kind of born of and produce for the digital age. So I have a sense of what people kind of in my generation, though, are looking for. And just as folks have developed a very high standard, for what they want to read, they've developed a very high standard for what they want to watch and how good those visuals should be. And as I mentioned before, people are spending their time on Hulu and Netflix and Amazon because it's the highest level of visual content. And when I was directing our investigative magazine at the Huffington Post, we were doing these kind of long form multimedia stories, and they had a ton of visual in them, and they were ultra long form. So the assumption would be no one's going to stick around, but we were averaging 1 million views per piece, and we were having long kind of engagement times throughout the pages, which told us that the more visual and the kind of higher level of visual that we presented to audience, the more engaged they were. And I would love to see this on the local news level, because, in the broadcast news level, because I think this is a time where there's a growing distrust of the media and a great mistrust of the media. And I think local news is very much a huge part of that solution, is reconnecting people with their local papers so that they can gain trust in something local and then have their national news delivered to them through those sources that they've developed trust in. And one way to do that is by expanding your capacity to do higher level visual storytelling. I actually had a call from a local news station in Oklahoma this morning who said, we love this. I'm now at the Marshall Project, and we just put out this big multimedia piece with kind of video and photo and all these kind of immersive aspects, and they said, we want to do that. Can you walk us through how? What kind of development and coding does it take? What were you shooting on? How were you doing this? And I think everyone's sensing that there's a big appetite for this, and if we can implement it on the local news level, I think it would be a great thing.
I think, I spent the first 9 years of my career in local news. I'm old enough that by default I had to start in broadcast, and had a foot in both of those worlds for a long time until coming to left field. The one thing that we talk about a lot is, the tropes. Are we doing this just because that's the way it's supposed to be done? Like, if it's Labor Day weekend, you have to go talk to the person at AAA about, like, make sure you pack an emergency kit, and air conditioning is actually more efficient than having your windows down. Like, there's certain stories that just happen over and over and over again, or like, why does that guy need to be on the roof to wrap this story? So looking for opportunities to do it more honestly. I think our audience really engages with a certain type of voice. So we're at NBC, we work with a lot of very seasoned, very accomplished broadcasters. And the one thing, we always go to the tracking booth with them. And I'm like, I need to break you from doing your voice. Just tell me, say the word "so" before you say your line. Explain it to me like we're at a bar and we've just had a beer. What are you working on right now? And as long as the journalism is just as impeccable and it's presented in a more honest way. You don't want people to get distracted by the perfect haircut and a blazer in the middle of devastation. Those sorts of things don't ring true to a younger audience. But it's not, people still ask me, what cameras are you using? My answer is, it doesn't really matter anymore, and it hasn't mattered for about 10 years. The types of equipment that's there, it's how you decide to use them. Like a broadcast camera and a Sony A7S, you're able to get similar images from them now.
The voice, the hair, the jacket, those are hard habits to break, though, aren't they?
Yeah. Well, and there's times they're very, very appropriate. You don't want somebody in a t-shirt sitting down to interview a sitting president or something like that.
But for us, I come from a very different side of course, these debates. We provide, production and workflow system for news. And so what we've seen is that 10 years ago, there was all of our customers, the mantra was repurposing, right? So whatever you had, packages you had produced, whatever studio show you had, you were cutting it and pushing it on digital. And at the time, there was the notion that was enough, right? And I think it enabled many of the local stations to have a presence, but not to actually develop a brand, not to develop a true identity on those digital platforms. And so little by little, what we've seen is actually, instead of leveraging this central news production system or whatever you have, creating a pocket of islands to address that more editorial quality content. So the discussion we're having today is, how do I bring back everybody together, right? How do I recreate synergy between my broadcast, digital, and social team so that the great work that has been done for digital can benefit the other team? So that's, on our end, that's a lot of things that we're working right now as a technology vendor.
And Frederick, can you tell us about the kinds of technologies coming online to help journalists in building those stories? I'm thinking, for instance, of how you're using AI.
Yeah, so I think it's part of the discussion that we're having. Again, we've our customers who want to branch out to do more like kind of like documentary style reporting. It's more investigative, it's stronger in editorial. There's a more emotional impact and components. So, but to do that, you still work within the framework and the constraints of fast-paced news production. So what we're working a lot is creating production assistants, leveraging AI, leveraging machine learning, so that if I'm starting to work on a piece, instead of searching 15 different sources, my archive, social, my Getty, my stock, all of that is being recommended to me, right? So it's a big effort that we're doing using natural language processing, machine learning, but so that basically we go in a world of frictionless production, right? So when you need to do that creative work, you don't go around looking for tapes, looking for that perfect shot, because some of you seems to have doing the production on your own. Some have like 6 to 7 team. Many of our customers don't have 3 or 4 AP that can help you dig into those archives, right? So we're here to basically bridge that gap. And the second big part of the things we're working on is, how do you enable all of that field work to be again seamless, right? Because a lot of that production happens by shooting content on the field, and it's not a documentary. You don't have 6 months to go back to the station, cut your piece for the next few weeks. So you need to be very agile. So we're building lots of services using Amazon to give people access to the content while they edit, to do remote editing and such.
So this one's for Bob, Emily, Matt, any of you. What kinds of other kinds of technologies, you've started talking about this a little bit, but other technologies, from the cameras to the editing to the design software, graphic software, really at this point need to be in the toolkit for an enterprising journalist right now? And what are the essential tools in your own toolkit?
Well, as a managing editor and father of young children, Frame.io has changed my life. I copy edited 2 videos while sitting in a playground last weekend. Just the ability to be connected and not tied to your desk. Especially we work with freelancers who are pretty far-flung, and trying to edit a piece as pen pals is always a little tricky. So I think anything that allows you to collaborate, and that it helps us a lot. Like right now, the graphics team we're using is in South America, and we're working on graphics for someone who's currently living in Turkey to do a story about New Zealand. And being able to put all those pieces together, we're hoping to, we've done some testing around the kind of new Adobe Cloud, which we haven't, just because NBC is monolithic, we haven't implemented yet, but those things are coming, and I'm really excited about those sorts of things too.
Emily or Matt?
Yeah, I guess everywhere I've gone, I've been working off of Premiere. I think at this point, I think there are still many people working off of Avid, and but in the kind of new age newsrooms, digital newsrooms, mostly Premiere. We use Frame.io. We use Dropbox and WeTransfer for storage and getting files to each other. In terms of camera gear, it's really a combination. As Bob was saying, we'll shoot with, on kind of the lower end, the Canon C300 Mark II, or the FS7s, or the A7S. And then, in the cases where we have the budget, we'll do something with like the ARRI, and do something that's a little higher end and more studio and lit. And I guess that covers it.
Well, I'll say one of the opportunities I've had at Tegna, which has been really great, is to conduct week-long training sessions for our stations and our multi-skilled journalists, who are essentially solo video journalists, who are turning stories every day, turning and burning. And so the gear that I would recommend is a little more functional first and portable in terms of the camera gear. We like to equip as many people as we can with GoPros, because you can turn your 1 camera shoot into a 2 camera shoot in 30 seconds, and it's great. We always talk about maximizing your nonlinear editor. I've used Premiere a bunch, but we use Edius also quite a bit at our Tegna stations, and the amount you can do graphic-wise with just the simple title tool and knowing some basic effects and the crop feature, that can go a long way. And I think when we were talking about innovative storytelling, it's easy to point to pieces like what we've watched today, but there's also the very quick and theoretically minor innovations of just creating a beautiful graphic on your own that fits your story in 30 minutes, because that's the amount of time you have. And I think knowing how to use a program like Edius, or with Adobe, I think it's more After Effects than Premiere, but you can still do it with both. That's one thing that we always like to say. It doesn't add an ounce of extra gear to your kit, but you can do a lot with it. And so that's a big part of what I do.
So this question is to any of you. If you could snap your fingers and change one thing about television news workflow technology, what would it be?
It's still one of the biggest challenges is getting video from here to there. You mentioned Avid, like the broadcast side for us is in Avid, and everything at NBC is built around it getting into an Avid suite into broadcast, and getting things from our archive is actually really hard. Or one of our journalists is traveling, and we said, hey, Apple News emailed us, and they said they want a shorter version of your piece because all of our pieces are too long. And they like them to be under 3 minutes. And they'll say, well, I got OneDrive at home in Brooklyn, and the other one's on is with me out in the field. So, being able to access the video we have, like we sit on one of the oldest video archives in the world, and when we first started Left Field, we're like, oh, we need to utilize this. Like, there's so much we can do with all of this archive. And then be like, well, it's somewhere in a warehouse in Charlotte, and so we end up, YouTube is our friend. Like, we look up NBC things on YouTube and leave them there as placeholders, and then like the day before we publish, we go to the intern and we're like, can you figure out where the actual source file of this lives? Because it's impossible to find.
Obviously I'm a very biased view of that discussion, but I think echoing what you just said, I think there's many of our customers really work solely around the rundown, right? So the rundown is basically the whole source of information and exchange and synchronization between the team, whereas what you really want to do is extract yourself from these constraints and create a true collaboration platform that has nothing to do with the historical constraint of broadcast news, so that, as you said, that content is available everywhere by everybody, whatever you're going to produce. Today, I'm not going to say it's a two-class system, but if you have the station, you have all of the power capacity that you want. The moment you leave, you don't have access to your archive, you don't have access to production capabilities. You're very limited, right? Which in turn impacts your agility to quickly produce those stories. So for me, it's this, getting rid of that part of that legacy workflow and really building systems that are fully, hybrids, exposed to both internal resources and external resources.
So switching gears, Bob, Left Field was launched as a kind of test lab for NBC, but it didn't stay in that lane for very long. So can you talk a little bit to where your work there has spilled into other aspects of NBC?
Sure. I think we know we're lucky to be able to do the kind of breadth of work that we're doing. And I think maybe one of the reasons I was brought in is talked a lot in my interviews about how I wanted to make it sustainable, and I wanted to make it something that isn't, oh wow, that's so great, and then we run out of money. So we're always doing the dance between innovation and delivering actual views and trying to grow our social accounts, which is something that NBC prioritized for us. But you don't want to lose that innovation. I think it's just thinking about where you take those swings. So with the mixed reality, because it is something that actually is really easy to learn, we have a few different teams within NBC and have started teaching them how to do it. We wrote basically a how-to manual for how to do it. So they're doing the most complicated version of it that you can do, as far as it's the hardest to execute, but there's so many things you could be doing with it that are a lot easier. And we're also collaborating with the obvious person with data science, with Steve Kornacki, who does all of the pollster and election night kind of deep dives into these things. So looking for ways to collaborate with other people, like innovate and push it out throughout the network is something that we're engaged on, as well as sponsored content and views and revenue and all those other things. But we put a value on who we're collaborating with and how we're influencing the rest of the news division.
And a few months ago, I did a story about left field. I know there was talk of getting the NBC-owned stations involved as well. Has that happened yet, or is that in the roadmap?
Well, I'm actually having a meeting with some of them this week, so we've had a few one-offs. Matt, my predecessor, went to an O&O conference for the investigative teams, and it's a great idea, and it's something that we're continuing to develop. Is, as the national organization, there is no way that we are going to know the level and intricacy of the stories that are affecting communities that local news team does. But we also have resources that they don't, mostly time. Like I lived that life. I know what it's like to turn 2 pieces a day and present them both live, get in the truck and come back at the end of the night. So for those things that, the stories that they want to tell and for whatever reason they can't free up the resources, it's amazingly mutually beneficial, especially on the investigative end, to say, come to us, we'll help collaborate along with you and do something that's really valid that you might not be able to do on your own. And we've had a lot of interesting conversations about that, and we're starting to circle in on a few projects that we're going to collaborate on.
I have about 60 more questions for you, but I want to see if anybody in the audience has one to interrupt me first.
Left on the one. Matt, question for you. 5 hours out in the field shooting. I think I saw rails and a camera move on the still picture in the phone, but it may have been a static shot with a stream going left to right behind it.
So that was with the slider.
You had it, okay.
I had a slider, but I do want to actually...
5 hours? And you got all that set up and you did that there, or was that done later?
I should mention that part was done back at the station afterward in the one... I forget how long it took to write and edit, probably a full day. But in the midst of that, I knew that I was going to have a lot of photos of Sarah, and I wanted, again, kind of that poignant presentation of it. I have a slider through the station, which, again, I think part of what has allowed me to do work like that is just having the latitude and being able to use the gear that we have. But even then, that was about 30 minutes. That was actually outside our station's front door. But it was something that I also had in the back of my head. And I did take that down to the Panhandle. I did another piece all about the issues that the pecan farmers were facing. And I wanted to start with this kind of 15-second high-minded rumination on the pecan about how it's this product of patience and how, you can plant a cotton seed and a year later it's turning around cotton. But a pecan, you plant a seed, you wait 10 years for a tree to grow, and then you start turning your profits. So that's why, when the hurricane knocked over hundreds of thousands of trees, it was especially devastating for them. So anyway, for that, while I was down there, I took out the slider, and I essentially, there were these bowls of pecans when I went to the different farms, or in some cases, they were on the ground from where they had fallen off the hurricane, and I took it out and deployed it for that purpose. But I think the key for me, because it was a lot going down there for 4 days, telling 4 different stories, setting up 4 different stories, and then trying to figure out which gear made the most sense for each thing. But again, sometimes it's just that having that extra thought beforehand about where can I deploy this best, and that can end up saving time, I feel like, because then those slider shots are 5-7 seconds.
If we have time for one more quick question.
How do you tell your team to not put 10 pounds of potatoes in a 5-pound bag? The bottom line is too much information is overload. So what's your strategy when you tell your team to go out and get a story? Because we're all storytellers. At the end of the day, we're telling a story. A lot of times, my team, they try to put 10 pounds of potatoes in that 5-pound bag.
Are you referring to more informationally, or in terms of like the innovation, the visual?
Just everything, so that way when the product is produced, you're not overloaded with too much information.
The text piece is my best friend. As soon as it goes in that direction, I'm like, maybe you can write an article on this one too. One of the joys of digital. Because truth is people remember how they feel more than they remember every single fact. And some things are better in a different format. But it's tricky because any good reporter wants to hold on to their facts very tightly because they've spent months finding those facts. So yeah, it's always the dance, but trying to figure out other platforms, other mediums that can incorporate some of the deeper details, I think is the main trick.
I'm lucky in that I get to work in multimedia formats a lot of the time, and what that means is that there might be a 10 to 20,000 word piece going with the video content that allows you to really dig into that nuance. In fact, I did a piece with Steve Brill that was 63,000 words, which was more of a book, but it was an online presentation of that book. But in terms of video, actually, the Marshall Project at Left Field recently collaborated on a project which was about incarcerated parents who, because of this particular law, lose their kids forever, wiped from their birth certificates, never allowed to talk or see them again. And I was working with a producer from Bob's team, and we were struggling with how do we convey so much of the nuance of this topic. And it's a very intricate and complicated topic in just 10 minutes. And 10 minutes in web video is long form, but for us and for that story, it's really short. And I'm a big believer in not losing the nuance and not oversimplifying the story. So what that means is it's working really closely with an editor, not a video editor, like an editor, like a magazine or news editor, to really think about like what are the points in this story that you absolutely cannot live without, and what are the things that we can hint at or imply or bring to life in graphics or bring to life in a text card to give people a sense of where they should be looking next without overloading them. So it's a delicate dance, but I think that's what's most important to me is I have no intention of ever putting out a video piece that loses nuance, because when it's oversimplified, it doesn't do anything for anyone. It's just content, and I'm not interested in content. I'm interested in good journalism, and so you have to find the balance.
And in digital, giving something that's nuanced, you see it's reflected so much in the amount of engagement and comments. The Florida piece for us has thousands of comments. It has the most comments of any piece that we've done. And the ones where we tell people more of how to feel, you see it has 10 comments usually from somebody's friends. And then it slowly dies, because in a social setting, social media setting, that engagement is usually what's helping the algorithms push you back forward. And your story it caught fire 9 months after it published. It did well when it published. And then we woke up one morning and we're like, what happened here? And now I know it's like guaranteed like a few thousand views every time I go to sleep at night. I wake up in the morning like, hey, still going.
Well, that's what's interesting, is that I think a lot of folks feel that you need to pull down a story, and it's kind of like journalistic prowess in order to get it across to people. And it was, I'm pretty sure, the highest performing video on YouTube for you guys. And there are other stories that are a lot more easy to digest, that aren't about sex trafficking and opiate addiction in Florida. Like and we get pretty in depth on how the structure works, and it's very nuanced. But I think you'll find that people engage. That's kind of where I come back to.
It's still entertaining.
It's entertaining. That's what comes back to the cinematic techniques. Is like you keep the nuance, but you use the visual to help people.
You can't guilt people into engaging with your content, especially on an open forum like YouTube. Like if somebody sits down to read the New Yorker, like they might read everything in the New Yorker, but if it's us and a bunch of people playing Fortnite videos, like, and people opening eggs, like how do you get them in the door and then keep them there, and then they're willing to engage?
I love the idea that we're ending on the notion of nuance at a news technology conference, which is a very zen way to close.